Terminator was released in 1984, and for many movie fans is considered an all-time classic film. Arnold Schwarzenegger, time travel, James Cameron. It was going to be hard for this not to be excellent. But there's always been a cloud surrounding my thoughts on Terminator, a looming question in my mind and at least 14 other people's minds. Is Terminator a horror movie? Now, you may laugh at first and say, hey, I don't think it's a horror movie, but if you really look at it on the surface, it actually does have some elements that suggest it might be a horror movie. You could easily say that it's a slasher with an indestructible monster going around killing people at night. I mean, if Jason is horror, why not Terminator? I know, in 2020, it might seem like the importance of genre maybe has been diminished. There are a lot of mixing of genres, and you may ask yourself, why even limit yourself to a genre? Well, beyond marketing purposes, genre shapes everything from the characters to the plot elements to the audience expectations of what they're going to see. Now, selfishly, as a collector, I like grouping my Blu-rays by genre. It just feels like the proper way to do it. And also, when you ask your partner what kind of movie they're in the mood for, you're better off not getting a response of, how about a horror comedy with action and a hint of romance? There are important patterns and ingredients that define a genre. And with so many movies and shows out there, knowing a film's genre can at least save you a lot of time. That said, my favorite genre is horror, and I'm always intrigued by movies that seem to place as borderline horror movies. They're right on the cusp of, is this horror or is this not horror? So that's what this series I'm doing is I'm looking at movies that may or may not be horror movies. First up today is Terminator. Now, some call it action, some call it sci-fi, some have even called it romance. Now, the series as a whole is definitely not horror. In fact, Wikipedia has labeled the series as science fiction action movies, and I think that's pretty accurate. But today we're just focusing on the first one. So I'm going to break it down to a few categories in order to explore if Terminator qualifies as a horror movie. The first category is atmosphere and pace. So one of the standout things about Terminator is that it was shot mostly at night. There are a few day scenes at the beginning of the movie, but once it gets going, this is a movie that takes place at night and is very dark. Now, dark lighting and night scenes are synonymous with horror films. That's just kind of the aesthetic normally you see in horror films because things are scary at night, so most of them take place at night. So the look of Terminator absolutely matches a horror movie. If you're just flipping channels and you happen to stumble upon a random scene of Terminator, you may think that you're watching a horror movie. So atmosphere-wise, I'm going to go ahead and say yes, Terminator does have a horror movie atmosphere. Now, pacing-wise, what's typical of horror movies is a slower pace with an emphasis on suspense and building a sense of dread through tension and our characters being in danger. The first half of Terminator does have that slow burn feel of a horror movie. Well, maybe not in the first half, let's say the first 30 minutes. But once we get to that bar scene where all hell breaks loose, and we have the 80s cheesy music playing and Kyle Reese reveals himself. Once we get to that point, the pacing begins to resemble an action movie, kind of an action adventure. We move from action scene to action scene, only slowing down for character building moments. You know, it's not like horror movies don't have action. They do tend to have action, but those tend to be in the last part of the movie when the hero confronts the villain. And that's honestly usually the least scary part of the film. So Terminator mostly has more of an action adventure pace. So I'm going to say negative on horror as far as pace-wise goes. The music. The classic Terminator score that we all know and love, it more has a melancholy sense of dread. It's more sad than scary, to be honest. Plus, any possible terror might be ruining that bar scene when we hear this. So I'm going to say that, musically speaking, as far as the score goes, Terminator does not have a score that would typically line up with most horror movies. So I'm going to say negative on the score. Are there jump scares? The first part of the movie resembles a typical horror slasher. You have Arnold going around and killing people brutally and without remorse. But these death scenes aren't filmed like death scenes in horror movies. There is no element of surprise, no killer coming out of the shadows or jumping up from behind the couch. Quite frankly, the Terminator has no need for that. He's a big dude with a giant gun. He's able to simply ring the doorbell, ask your name, and shoot you in cold blood. So because his presence is so big and telegraphed, the movie lacks any real jump scares that would normally be in a horror film. So I'm going to say that it's a negative once again on horror as far as jump scares go. Is there a villain that is scary in both intent and presentation? Now, by intent, I mean, is this a character who has a scary intention for our heroes? But intent is not everything. Presentation is also very important. Think of Dr. Evil. He may have a scary intent, but nobody's going to take him seriously as a scary villain because of his goofy and comedic presentation. Whereas Jason Voorhees is scary in both his intent and his presentation. He wants to kill everybody, he's a big menacing figure, he's going about in a very scary way, so his presentation is super scary. Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator is both scary in intent and presentation, so he does qualify. You know, Arnold is such a big guy that even if he wasn't a robot, him going around killing people with his bare hands would still be scary. Now, without question, if that was the story, this would without question be a horror movie. I mean, even if it was just him chasing Sarah Connor by herself the entire movie, that would make this more of a horror movie. It's ultimately the presence of Kyle Reese as a competent soldier who can fight back that makes Arnold less scary and makes the whole situation less scary. At least Sarah has a soldier sent back in time to protect her, and they have weapons, and they can run, so that kind of takes some of the horror out of it also. Would the movie still work without the horror elements? Now, if you think of a movie as a game of Jenga, the question is, what elements could you remove without the whole damn thing collapsing? In almost every horror movie, if you remove the horror element, it would lose its purpose and not work as a movie. This is how you can really determine what genre a movie is. There's one element of every movie that if you take it out, the movie doesn't work. And that's the movie's core genre. As much comedy as in Lethal Weapon, it could still work as an action movie. As much action as is in Rush Hour, it wouldn't work without the comedy. Now, Terminator has a limited amount of horror elements, but if you remove them, both the movie and the story would still work. I mean, the death scenes could easily be off screen, Arnold could easily be played by Pee Wee Herman, and the movie could take place all during the day. And I think it would still work. Well, maybe not the Pee Wee Herman part. So overall, I have to say that in my opinion, based on those factors, overall, Terminator is not a horror movie. But it does make me wish that Arnold would do a horror movie, as that would probably be amazing.
I don't do requests.